Happy afternoon to all of you. And today we'll be having another learning episode here with us at the UP Cebu TLRC. Your TLRC office here at UP Cebu is your partner in learning over here online. Now, we would like to say hi to all of our attendees or participants. Some are coming from Pasig, from Davao, hi po, from Batac, Ilocos Norte, from Calamba. So I just came from Laguna High over there, University of Perpetual Health System. We also have State College, Northwestern Mindanao State College of Science and Technology. Hi po. From Tacloban, ACLC Tacloban, thank you po for being here with us. And of course, those coming from Baybay City, Leyte, Visayas State University, I was able to visit your campus, and it's a very, very nice campus. Everyone, you should also go there as well. And those coming from Manila, watching from Manila, and of course in the Visayas region, thank you so much for being with us. Today, we will have another episode regarding KUANs. In Bisaya, the term KUAN is something that you cannot really express, but is there. So oftentimes, Bisaya or mga Cebuano tend to use the term KUAN to refer to something that they know of, but often cannot express. So today's KUAN is all about conventional versus authentic assessment in science education. And this will be a very interesting topic for us, especially, and maybe not all who are teaching right now is knowledgeable that there are some of dynamics between these two schools of assessment, authentic and traditional assessment. Now, today, one of our professors here in UP Cebu will talk about it and much of his ideas regarding these two schools of assessments. Okay, so by the way, everyone, I would like to let you know that we are already being live streamed. So you can watch us via Facebook. Am I right? Okay, so thank you so much for being with us, and also let's start. Let's rolling. Let's have our netiquettes. Tala.
Webinar reminders. We will be recording the webinar for documentation, evaluation, and dissemination purposes. Note that, by attending, you are permitting us to use any form of participation for such purposes. Mute your microphone during the talk. We want to make sure that the speaker is audible to everyone. We may remove you from the Zoom if you do not comply with this request. Refrain from taking pictures or videos of other participants. You may be held accountable for data privacy violations if you post such photos and videos without consent. For questions and inquiries, you may utilize the Zoom Q&A feature. Questions will be addressed after the presentation. Don't forget to evaluate. The link to the evaluation form will be posted in the chat box at the end of the webinar. It will be accessible for 10 minutes only. Digital certificates will only be given to those who have successfully registered, participated, and answered the evaluation form.
Okay, so that's our reminders, our webinar reminders, as well as netiquettes. So please do remember all of these rules. Again, we upheld these rules for everyone's privacy and safety, and of course, for the flow of our program. Now, before anything else, I would like to say hi again to newcomers, our attendees. Some are coming from Visayas. Hi over there from Lapu-Lapu City. I know Cebu right now is having a rainy season because of the thunderstorms and going in low pressure area in the region. Also, hi to Constancio P. Go Memorial Learning Center attendees over there. Thank you so much for being with us. And to those who are coming from the international schools who are tuning in to our learning episode today. Now, to give us an introduction to our speaker, let me call on Sir Nan Bernardes, Professor Nan Bernardes, our coordinator of the TLRC. to introduce to us our esteemed speaker.
Thank you so much, Miss Jara. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today's event. Mr. Ryan Daniel Dablo is actually a dedicated educator with a diverse background in both the health and also in education sectors. He holds a bachelor's degree in nursing and also a diploma in professional education with a specialization in biology. Furthering his academic journey, he completed a Master of Arts in Nursing and also a Master of Education in Biology, graduated with distinction from the University of the Philippines, Cebu. Mr. Dablo began his career as a clinical instructor, a role that he excelled in for 5 years. Then he transitioned to teaching, where he has spent the past 6 years as a senior high school teacher. And currently, he imparts his knowledge of biology and earth science to students in the UP Cebu High School program. His extension experience and also his commitment to education make him an invaluable asset to the academic community. I know that we're all excited to have our event started. So please help me welcome Mr. Ryan Daniel Dablo.
Welcome aboard, Sir
Yeah,
Ryan.
yes, thank you very much, Sir Nand and Ms. Jera. They are my very helpful colleagues here with me at UP Cebu. And good afternoon to all of those who are attending the seminar. It is my pleasure to meet you. And I'd like to express how much of a pleasure it is to be among science teachers, particularly because it's funny that when we ask for hiring of science faculty, they seem to be a rarity. It's hard to find them, and yet here we are, 100 strong. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us in this afternoon's affair. So without further ado, allow me to get into the meat of my talk. Allow me to share my presentation. So I hope it's visible on screen. So the title being Conventional versus Authentic Assessment in Science Teaching, with a focus on secondary education. But as Sir Nand introduced me earlier, it would seem that I'm actually climbing down the educational ladder, working my way from college, then to senior high school, then to high school. So at this rate, it might be interesting to go handle something like kindergarten after this, right? It's very muggy here in Cebu, but I hope that you're comfortable within the confines of your houses or offices. I would like to begin by saying that I actually trolled when I created the title for this webinar because it would have you believe that I'm somehow pitting conventional against authentic assessment when nothing could be further from the truth. I am of the contention that they exist on a spectrum and we can utilize as little or as much of either. And so the conversation this afternoon is what I want the conversation to be is how do we bridge the gap and how do we have a healthy balance between the two modes of assessment? For our purposes, uh, let us just walk through the disclaimer that I was thinking about in my thought process when working through my way in the seminar. Like I mentioned, I think that conventional and authentic assessment are not in competition with one another, but rather they are complementary. They supplement one another, and it falls to us to have a delicate balance between the two. As mentioned by Professor Gumalal Misjera, who was one of my professors in my master's degree, conventional and authentic assessment belong to separate schools of thought. They're not against each other, and I believe that no one method is superior to the other. So I'd like this to be an exposition into the metrics and usage of assessment that we here in the Philippines have and our complicated relationship with conventional and authentic assessment. Just to be clear, allow me to set my definitions. Conventional assessment is what we conceptualize as the traditional form of assessment. So you will know them as tests, quizzes, standardized examinations, and the like. Traditional assessment is often the name you hear, but this has fallen in popularity because tradition has a different connotation depending on your locale. right? Different schools even will have different cultures. So traditional would be different for each school. So the preferred term is to use conventional assessment to refer to these methodologies. On the other hand, you have authentic assessment, which instead of getting an inference of learning, actually get evidence that the learning has taken place. So these are very, very varied, but among their characteristics are the construction of a high quality response, product or output from the students, and the quality of being integrative, iterative, and having the capacity for evaluation, as well as the integration of 21st century skills. We'll go through the gist of this in the as we go through the slides, right? So the reason why I'm such an advocate of fueling authentic assessment, because it is the least used between the two, actually happened early on in my teaching career. So as mentioned, I once handled a different uh, education level. I worked my way from college downward. But when I started, being a greenhorn teacher, you usually default to a behaviorist paradigm. You're very idealistic and you default to the basics, right? So I was handling microbiology then, and um, the way I had assignments were similar to assignment A as you see on screen. So something to that effect, telling students to go to the library, to go and find a book to read about something like, for instance, fungi or lichens, and then answer a set of follow-up questions. And for most of the time, it worked. Right, there was nothing really to comment about it. It worked, and I was satisfied. But there came a point in my teaching career that the students no longer responded to that form of assignment. So the generation change finally happened, and arose Generation Z, right? They were now the learners that we were handling and dealing with. And if I threw them the same type of assignment, it seemed that they no longer responded well to that. So I asked myself, how do I remain relevant to the teaching profession? And so I racked my brain and decided to change the way I did things. So where before I gave an assignment similar to assignment A in pattern, after the change, after my epiphany, I went on to do something along the lines of assignment B. So to read through it, you can find lichen, mold, or fleshy fungus because I was handling microbiology. Take a selfie, be creative with the hashtags, and then tell the class about your partner in the selfie. So to the keen-eyed among you, nothing really changed. I simply disguised it in a different form. But to my surprise, it had a very pleasant effect. Now, microbiology is a complicated subject. Most students wouldn't call it their favorite. It's complex, it's complicated, right? So, to my surprise, they were excited that day in class. They wanted to share, and they even had the initiative to go for groofies and the like, Gen Z being Gen Z. So, at that moment, I had a light bulb experience that, yeah, this is the way to go. This is the way forward. Simply disguising it with fluff and frills changed the way my students responded to my teaching style. So I never looked back from there. In my case as a teacher, I had 13 years of experience. So I went through the change when senior high school was institutionalized and when constructivist paradigms became more emphasized, right? So I was really an advocate of constructivist methodology and authentic assessment from then on out. Let's go to the details about what the Philippine education landscape looks like in order to provide a framework and a groundwork for my discussion later on. So this will be very, very brief. As science teachers, I believe you're familiar with both the TISA and TIMS rather, and PISA results. They paint the Philippine education, particularly with regards to science, mathematics, and reading, as very, very horrendous. In fact, it was so horrible that we didn't take the more recent TIMS. We did take the recent PISA, and the results were all around social media, and you may be familiar with what went on, particularly with regards to creativity. Now, I am not saying that these are the end all be all when it comes to dictating what's good and what's not in education, but they serve as useful benchmarks, right? To compare ourselves with how the rest of the world is faring. And we didn't do well. So, to that end, and to the credit of our educational sector, the government wasn't exactly idle. They did do something, and part of the initiative is the things that you see on screen, right? As to their efficacy, I cannot comment on that. But to be fair and to be as objective as possible, our educational sector did do something, a few initiatives to address the problem. The most recent ones being the BEDP 2030 and the Matatag Agenda. Now, you might also be aware that we have had a recent change in leadership in our educational sector, so fingers crossed to seeing what's going to happen in the near future, right? The education landscape is always in flux, and we hope that it's for the better this time around. I do want to pick up something from that set of initiatives that I wanted to share with you from the Basic Education Act of 2013 and lifted directly from RA 10533. It states that the curriculum should adhere to a specific standard, in this case, a contextualized and global standard, and one that will use methods that are constructivist, inquiry-based, reflective, collaborative, and integrative. So something that toots the horn of authentic assessment and constructivist methodology. I do want to mention that in no way is there stated that we should forego conventional assessment. Again, I am stating that it's not one or the other, they're not mutually exclusive, but rather they exist in a spectrum, and it falls to us to strike a balance between the two. That is at least the contention that I have. Because of my advocacy, I did conduct a study about assessment because I wanted to challenge the statistics, right? Going back to the COVID pandemic, science teachers were the very first to rally behind vaccination because, I'd like to think that science teachers were progressivist and forward thinking. So, in the same vein, now that education is trending towards constructivist paradigms and authentic assessment, I was also of the opinion that science would be at the forefront, right? But sadly, the literature does not paint it that way. In the course of my study, I unearthed a few contemporary researches that mentioned the following. For instance, a recent study by Sarmiento and others pointed out that most teachers in STEAM institutions exclusively utilize conventional assessment, and only a minute percentage utilize novel assessment techniques. This is also mirrored in other parts of the world. The trend is being adopted, but the change is occurring in very small scales. In another study, I had unearthed this interesting tidbit that it has something to do with teachers as well and their academic qualifications, as well as the length of time that they stay in the profession, right? So you may be familiar with, or you may have experienced firsthand, the very fast turnover rates in education. I was mentioning a while ago about the difficulty when it comes to hiring science teachers. It turns out that several studies have commented that when teachers have a higher academic qualification and a higher experience, they are often more versatile when it comes to assessment. And this is true, right? I think we've lived through this as novice teachers. We default to the easiest, the very basic. So it wouldn't be a surprise to note that less experienced teachers and less academically qualified teachers will often default to conventional assessment. And it comes with experience as well as academic qualifications. The more that a teacher discovers about education, the more they're willing to try out novel techniques. So if we allow teachers to settle and pursue studies and allow them the freedom to do what they want, they will often set into the role and learn more about it. But if there's a continuous um, exchange and turnover of teachers, they'll never be improving in their practice and will be left with a workforce of teachers that rely on authentic assessment, which is unfortunate, right? So, with regards to perspectives on both students and teachers, I was able to collate research related to the following. So, authentic assessment being new and being nuanced, it has its certain difficulties. So these are the few that I've unearthed. On the part of the students, a study mentioned that sometimes students say that they lack supervision or suffer through unarticulated instruction. The instructions may not be clear, they're confused about something, or they lack the motivation to complete performance tasks. On the part of the teachers, on the other hand, They mention a lack of administrative support, and this really bugs me, overwhelming documentation. So I don't know if this is something that's relatable to you, but this is one of the major gripes that teachers have, particularly in the basic education sector. Overwhelming documentation just makes things very difficult. And if we compound this issue with, everything else that there is to do, a mountain of paperwork, naturally teachers would default to the basic. And a need for training as well has been expressed. On the other hand, one of the more interesting things that I've unearthed is that this is difficult to do. The trend from conventional to authentic assessment is difficult to do because it requires a paradigm shift, a change in our culture. Because in the Philippines, we have been long mired in a culture of bureaucratic testing. You see this everywhere, standardized tests being the end all be all, and everything just boils down to passing a test, topping a test, making sure that you pass a test in order to prove your worth. We see this in licensure examinations. So it's a culture that's ingrained in the Philippines, and I can provide no solution for that, at least as of this moment. Although this data was from quite a dated source, no? 2005, the Rennert-Arrive framework on authentic assessment, I think that it still holds true to the experience that we have right now. It's a culture that's deeply rooted in the Philippines, and it's hard to move from there. Now, let it never be said that we're not practicing what we preach. So I would like to ask your input on something, right? So in the course of my study, I looked at a few general, conventional, and authentic assessment methodologies, and they're all lumped up together on the screen. So just mentally, I want you to take note of which ones you think are more commonly applied in class versus rarely applied in class. So if you would, just make a mental ranking of the methodologies that you see on screen, from conventional assessment, creative performance, etc., down to research-based outputs below. So perhaps I'll give you a minute to think through about which ones in your experience have been applied a lot in the classroom setting, and those that have been rarely applied, if at all. And then I will reveal the content of what I unearthed in the course of my study, which was concluded last year. Incidentally, the study focused on Metro Cebu, urban Cebu, but I looked at 7 schools that were quite populated, right? And as to the teachers that I included in the study, each of them had at least 3 years of teaching experience, so I had confidence that they knew what they were on about. They had experience and facility. Furthermore, the study corroborated contemporary researches. So although it looks at a microcosm of education, I believe that it is reflective of our experience as science teachers all over the Philippines, particularly in urban areas. So when I concluded this study, this was the joint perspective of both teachers and students. Number 1 on the list, to nobody's surprise, conventional assessment was deemed as applied always. Following that, in decreasing order of frequency, you have creative performance, followed by project-based output, and followed by experiments, which I'm happy about because this being science teaching, it was ranked quite high. This was followed by practical tests, followed by model creation, followed by oral recitation, which was surprising. It was quite low. And then you have research-based outputs, and at the very tail end, the most difficult to apply assessment methods, portfolios, journals, or even case studies. To give a more detailed view of this picture, allow me to have this screen. It has the applied always characteristic with conventional assessment, applied frequently to all the rest, and applied very rarely are the most perhaps niche applications. We have case study, journals, and portfolios. We'll get to what that implies, right? But I do want to point out something that I found quite interesting. In the course of my study, the students and teachers more or less had alignment in their views. They usually ranked things the same way, except for one crucial thing when it came to experiments. In this case, teachers ranked experiments quite high, meaning that they applied it all the time. But students ranked it lower, meaning that they did not experience it all the time. So I consider this quite interesting, this being science, right? And because my study was mixed methods, I had the good fortune to triangulate the data and ask in depth what really the problem was about. It turned out that sometimes we do simulations and demonstrations of experiments. So to our view, we did something that is an experiment. But for students who never got to actually manipulate stuff, it wasn't an experiment for them. It was just learning by viewing. So when I asked teachers why this was so, they mentioned that sometimes experiments become, and I quote, for your eyes only because of some complications, chief among them, the lack of facilities and resources, and sometimes the difficulty with class size. So experiments no longer become feasible because they're dealing with very large class sizes. And I consider this quite problematic, right? In my research, I looked at the average class sizes in the Philippines, and it turns out it's a number between 40 to 65. 65 is simply too big. So if you're dealing with such a problem, such a reality, kudos to you, teachers. But 65, that's quite difficult in practice, right? So I can only imagine the plight, and my heart goes out to those teachers who deal with such. So that's interesting. On the other hand, and I would like to congratulate you on this, science teachers are quite cognizant about authentic assessment. They know that it's effective, for example. They think that it's generally feasible and they view its qualities as essential. Again, the qualities being the capacity for integration, iteration, application of 21st century skills, the creation of a high quality response, product, or output from the student, something that serves as proof that learning has taken place. So perception-wise, teachers are well aware of authentic assessment, and they even know that it's applicable. So what is the problem with the data? Why isn't it that though we're trending towards authentic assessment, it's not being practiced, right? So teachers do utilize it, but the problem has sometimes something to do with institutional and infrastructural support, particularly when it comes to facilities, resources, where teachers have to make ends meet, and sometimes less support in terms of books, references, or materials. So teachers have to start from scratch. And for a greenhorn instructor, that's not the easiest thing to do. So a lot of difficulties, a lot of complications on the plight of the teacher in order to make this the data more nuanced, right? I do have other observations that I'd like to share. Science teachers also point out that, and this I agree with, authentic assessment typically is harder to grade and are more time consuming for them. And time is a premium resource in education where we have to sometimes uh, have the need to cover stuff. The other is it requires well-developed rubrics. And this, as mentioned by one of the teachers or several teachers in the interview, it can be challenging to apply and may no longer be feasible because of extremely large class sizes. Again, they may not be well supported in terms of learning resources, and although they are applicable, they may have niche applications in some science subjects, particularly in some of the subdisciplines. I looked at the study with a generalist perspective, lumping science together, but it might be interesting to pinpoint what do biology teachers do in practice, what do physics teachers, chemistry teachers, and earth science teachers do in practice. So that is beyond the scope of my study, but that might be interesting on a further note, right? With regards to the students, what do they say? No, it turns out that again, they're quite aligned. Students like conventional assessment, but they would prefer to also be evaluated using authentic methodology. To some, the usage of authentic assessment even paints teachers as more prepared when it comes to the classroom practice. Students do say that they are exposed to a variety of methods, including authentic ones, and that their education has really enhanced their 21st century skills. And because Gen Z being Gen Z, they like collaboration. They thrive on social interactions. It's just the way of the world. They like it when they're put on the spotlight and do the interacting. So how do we go forward from this and how do we bridge the gap? So that is the final leg of my talk. It's a very brief talk, and I have divided it into three. Now, although the next few slides will be anecdotal, these will also be most of use to people in the secondary education sector because that is where my experience lies, right? But the principles might still apply even if you go down to more basic education or go higher to tertiary education. The least glamorous of my tips has something to do with planning. So I cannot stress the fact that you need time ahead of the actual time to really set things in stone. So planning is key when wanting to bridge the gap between conventional and authentic assessment. It's very important that you draft an assessment plan that addresses your needs, right? Um, this is difficult because it requires preparation on the part of the teacher, but I cannot discount the importance of planning in this affair. We really need to plan out. It doesn't matter if you're utilizing whatever um, construct. You can use lesson plans, curriculum guides, syllabi. You can go for whatever specific thing. Like I, for example, personally like grasps and assure model. People can have ADDIE or whatever. It doesn't matter. What is important is that you set up your learning goals and plan ahead. How do you assess your students then? Another thing that I'd like to suggest is to start strong. It's a bit counterintuitive, right? You start out with authentic assessment instead of a lecture in class, because the benefit is that more often than not, it's at the tail end of a grading period that students are often bombarded with the heavy stuff, like projects. So if you start at the onset, it may give them a little bit of breathing room to focus on your constructive methodology and authentic assessment prior to being loaded with others at the tail end of a grading period. The other thing that I'd like to point out, and this was a very important and significant conversation piece when I did the interview, is that teachers mentioned that it's quite contentious to simply think of tests as purely traditional or authentic or conventional rather, right? If I go for a simple objective test or a quiz, sure, that is truly um, conventional. But what if I add nuance to it such that I'm also looking at not just lower order thinking, but higher order thinking skills as well? So despite it being a pencil and paper test, it is authentic now. So you can actually transcend the classification, let's call it that, by applying smart test construction, utilizing your TOS well, and making sure that your test is multidimensional, right? So that's one of the things that teachers pointed out. Even if I have quizzes or tests, but if I add and enhance it such that it now looks at something actual, it has transcended to become authentic assessment. So that's quite interesting there. And sadly, the reverse could also be true. You can personally state, for instance, that you're applying a portfolio, but then it's nothing but a collation of test results. So be very careful with identification and identity, because that is one of the things that was pointed out in the Rennert-Areve framework that I encountered whilst undertaking the study. The other thing that I'd like to point out is, even if tiny, let's add improvements to our assessment practice by, as much as possible, incorporating elements of 21st century education. The interesting thing that I unearthed in my research is that, for the most part, teachers are on top of things when it comes to 21st century education, but they trail a little bit and lag a little bit when it comes to evaluation. They value timely feedback and teacher evaluation, and but they're not so big on peer evaluation or self-evaluation, which is one of the hallmarks of authentic assessment. The other thing that I like to point out is it can be even as simple as applying multimodal assessment, right? If we do not add too many restrictions on the output that we want, and instead go for something free form that will allow students to pick essentially what output they want to submit. And that can give another layer or dimension to your teaching. For instance, you can be talking about the rock cycle, give or take, let's say, and then you want a creative retelling perhaps, but instead of limiting your output to just a narrative, you can ask for a narrative, a poem, or a comic strip. You're hitting three multiple intelligences, different sets of intelligence at that, and you're adding nuance to your assessment practice even then. So if it's quite difficult, you can go for multimodal assessment. It's something that requires a little bit of experience, but it's one of the things that you can apply in class if it's too difficult to go for the more difficult to apply methodologies like journals, case studies, and portfolios, because honestly speaking, they do require planning and time. The last thing that I'd like to point out before I move on to my examples is just go for it, just do it, and just, yes, strive for authenticity wherever possible, right? Don't be afraid to mash things up. In music, there's this thing called a mashup where they combine different music into one harmony. So we can actually do that with assessments and science teaching too. Just because it's science doesn't mean we're limited to the traditionally science related assessments, right? We can mix and match however we please. And the last point that I'd like to discuss is, let's go back to the old days when we had a lot of immersion. And this went down in popularity because of a few issues years back when the safety during immersive activity was questioned. But it is doable and possible to accomplish immersion, and there is just no substitute for immersive activities. Students get a wide range of experience from it. And like I said, there's just no substitute for it. If you're located in downtown Cebu, one of the nice ideas might be to plan a visit to the museum. It's free, and it can be a nice tie-in with social science and science altogether, because the wings in that museum are related to those disciplines at the very least, right? In the case of the UP, we do a lot of field work in biology, and it's something that the students always look forward to. If that's too difficult, a simulation of a field study perhaps can also be done in school. I've done that successfully as a prep for the actual thing, and it was all students responded well to that, right? So for instance, let's go into something simple and let's see how we can enhance the nuance. So for example, let's default to something very, very basic. Identify the structure and function of organelles. That's something that a biology teacher is want to encounter in the course of their experience. So we can default to labeling of a diagram and then asking a quiz from them, and that's it. But we can actually form a nuanced assessment by adding tiny things. Like I mentioned, you can apply multimodal assessment. You can ask them to form analogies instead between different things and then create an infographic. And in the case of the second activity there, that's something that's located in the curriculum guide for biology for high school. The DepEd Ed people said that it's a good activity to create an edible model of a plant or animal cell. So switching slightly, like for instance, you can hide uh, what exactly they'll be making prior to the class so that they'll be surprised what it is that they'll be making in class. Or you can have add something like switching things with other groups and identifying that group's output instead and allowing them to critique that thing, because that will then add a layer to your assessment. It now becomes peer evaluated. And that's one of the things that you see in authentic assessment as well, right? Not just one person evaluating, but the peer as well, testing their knowledge against a construct. So that's something that you can do. I have an example here, but it's one of the things that I actually created. I wasn't able to ask permission from my students ahead of time to utilize their outputs for the analogy, as well as the selfies that they took in my Science 7 class, because they're still minors. On the other hand, I was able to ask permission from my grade 12 students because they're adults, all of them. So I'm able to have their pictures here. So we went field study in 6 different biomes near the shore so that we could hit as many as we wanted: estuary, benthic, intertidal, the works, right? So it's something that students look forward to. And like I mentioned, there is no substitute for immersion. The other thing that I'd point out, this time it's a chemistry class on an older set of students. It was consumer chemistry. So we had drugs as the topic, and we went down the way of the herbal preparation as a source for medication. And they did the usual stuff that could be expected of a class, went in the laboratory and synthesized stuff. But then you can add nuance again by asking a portfolio from them. Now, do take note that this was done in an entire grading period, so the portfolio spanned 2 months, right? A few weeks at the very least, five weeks, give or take. So it isn't something that I asked arbitrarily of my students. I really set the expectations ahead of time. Again, going back to my point, planning is very, very important, and the drafting of your assessment plan is important when it comes to getting a bird's eye view about what you want to engage the learners with and how you want them to be assessed in the future. So their outputs were quite amazing, and I do a little bit of writing on the side. So I was able to enjoy the outcomes of their portfolio as well. So even if this was a science class, it had the added difficulty of being mixed. So I was handling STEM and UM students at the same time. And so I wanted the science people to flex their technical skills as well as the UMS people to flex their creative writing skills. And we have a mash of that in this particular portfolio. I would like to think that they found it enjoyable because of the amount of pictures and creativity that went into this. And it made for fine reading on my end, so I enjoyed it as well. The very last thing that I like to point out is to never be afraid to keep students on their toes and be as unpredictable as possible, even if this is a science class. Like to give you an example, in a grade 8 class that I was handling, talking about weather and the atmosphere, they would never have expected that the thing I asked from them was a 2-minute short film that became popular because we had fun viewing it with the rest of the school. So it took a whole lot of Oscar vibes, and it was fun for the students. Or even if this was science, you can add elements of other things like photography and the like by asking from them a photo essay, for example, or a collation of pictures about cloud types, let's say, things like that. The very last thing that I like to point out is something that I learned from my professor. You may be finding in a lot of your discussions that there are sometimes when students ask a question that feels out of topic, veering away from what it is that you're trying to achieve in a single class. I call these teachable moments, a term coined by a professor that I worked with previously. And his advice was to always address questions no matter how off topic or tangential. The reason being that the significance of that question will diminish with time. If you say something like, hold that thought and I'll go back to that in a future discussion, the significance might be lowered. So there and then, grab that teachable moment and address it, because that's one of the things that I'd like to end my talk on when it comes to values, right? And work making emergencies and unplanned moments work for you. So okay, this is the last slide. Thank God, right? So to give you a backstory, allow me to paint a little picture. We were talking about the hydrosphere then, but the students had come off from a very grueling week, and they asked me if we could do something chill for a change because they're just so loaded. So I said, sure, what do you want to do? And they said that they wanted a film showing. And I said, well, it has to be related to water because that's our topic. And they said, yeah, we'll watch The Meg, the most ludicrous, unscientific movie that exists, right? But then I transformed it to a learning experience by asking something from them. So we had fun doing during the film showing, and then I asked what was not plausible scientifically in terms of the depiction in the movie. So I still asked something from them that allowed this to become an assessment on the go. So my point being, do not be afraid to fail forward. So it wasn't planned, but I made it work, right? So something to that effect. The other thing was when dealing with, it was the Literature Language Fest, I believe. So it was about poems and literature and everything. And we just tied into the theming with something related to our topic. So in this case, a poem on water by Wisława Szymborska, which had implications to the science of the discussion. The last thing that I'd like to point out is values, because authentic assessment does have an element of emancipatory interest in it. And by this, I mean that it's meant to take someone from point A to point B, to elevate a person, as it were. Now, sometimes in science, the topics do not lend themselves well to values integration. Sure, there are a lot of topics that are good for values clarification, but sometimes the topics just don't make sense on a values perspective. Like, I don't know, dinosaurs, for example, or rocks, right? So if it's too hard to tie it back to values, please do not forget about the heart and soul of the subject It has something to do with imagination and curiosity, right? That sense of childlike wonder that a person has in the universe. So if we can inculcate that in our students, then that's values integration right there. Going back to what it means really to engage in scientific practice, right? It's to wonder at the state of the universe, ask questions, and exercise your creativity and imagination. One of the most rewarding things in secondary education is that moment when a student comes to you and says, I was inspired to follow this course or to take this course in college because of your uh, class. So, if we hearken back to that sense of imagination, curiosity, wonder, I believe that's the heart and soul of science, and it's a good springboard for authentic assessment too, because it's very, very constructivist. On that note, I actually end my talk. It's very, very brief, and the latter part was very, very anecdotal, but I hope that you picked up a thing or two from it, which you can then apply into your future discussions and lessons in class. So, again, I hope that you strike a balance between authentic and um, conventional assessment, and you strive little by little to make it more nuanced so that it's not just 100% conventional, but slowly creeping towards the middle in terms of constructivist philosophy and authentic assessment. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And on that note, God bless everyone.
Thank you so much, Sir Ryan. So let's give Sir Ryan a little bit of time to recompose, if that's a term, and rest for a bit before we start our Q&A session. Then again, TLRC offers a lot of learning experiences for everyone, and this is free. So as long as you follow us and also join us through registering in our webinars. Okay. So if you have any question, or you may put your questions in our Q&A box. Okay, we'll be waiting for you to write down all of those questions. I hope there are more than enough questions. And also, if you wanted to give, to thank or to congratulate Sir Ryan, or send us a message, you may put them in our chat box. Okay. Sir Ryan will be able to read that when you. Now let's wait for some questions.
Yeah, if I may, Miss Jet, no, they can also have sharings perhaps in chat, best practices, because yeah, this can be a conversation. To that point, I would really like to give a shout out to Miss Anna. I think it was. She mentioned that she was handling 70 students. That goes well beyond the average class size as pointed by DepEd. Mom, kudos to you. God bless for your I don't know how that happens.
It does happen.
It does happen, and it's unfortunate. When I was doing the interview, one of the things that I was very surprised by was the state of things that teachers were in. Like in one case, one of the interviews, I said they didn't have enough resources for a distillation apparatus thingy, Mamjera. So what they did was they didn't have running water in school, so they had to have a system where they put the cold water up top, and then it had to flow downward through gravity down below. So I cannot imagine what the creativity behind the students and teachers just to make ends meet for science. So if you're that type of teacher, yeah,
We
good on
salute
you.
we salute you. But that's a reality. There's a lot of schools and of course teachers and students who are having a hard time actually having an authentic experience with science experiments as well, because of the lack of funds as well as the lack of facilities and amenities inside their schools. However, as they try as much as possible to make ends meet, just like what you said. So, yeah. So let's check if there are any questions. Any questions, Mo? Mm, okay.
There is a
So
mention
while
here, Miss Jera, about rubrics. So I'd like to note what in particular about rubrics that um,
yeah,
what you would like to ask, Ma'am, no? So we can address the question better. Is it preference for rubrics? Is it how to make rubrics?
there's a lot of ways to do things.
Yes, there's a lot of things to consider.
Yeah.
Like, I think the main issue here is how granular the rubrics become. So,
Mm,
yeah, the difficult thing is it has a little bit. There are tools online that will help you make a rubric from scratch, but I think it's something that becomes more fleshed out the more experienced you are. I I, I
mm,
I hope you agree, Miss Jenna, because the more you know about the ins and outs of teaching, the more experienced you are at what you want to assess or evaluate in a particular task, for example. So it becomes more granular the more experienced you are. For starters, it might be helpful to have a tool online that will help you craft a rubric, or you can have something that's created for you, a pre-made rubric, as it were, that you can then use and see if it's effective for you. And after a little bit of experience, you can then begin crafting your own rubrics, and like I said, it becomes more granular with the practice, more detailed, and you know what to nitpick.
mm. That's actually correct. Now, another thing also, sir, when it comes to rubrics is also your ability to have a we often call this as the PCK, your pedagogical content knowledge. Because if your PCK is too low, you won't be able to determine which of the things are to be measured or to be evaluated when it comes to the lesson. And that would require a lot of content knowledge to be able to put that into a rubric or into a scalable checking system for the students or evaluation system for the students. And that's one thing about authentic assessment. One is your experience when it comes to teaching. Another is your level of knowledge when it comes to the things that you are actually teaching. Because the more you know about what you're teaching, the more you know what are the things are what are the parts of what you are teaching is more important for the students to learn. And that should be the parts that should be evaluated, whether conventionally or authentically. So that is also one. So one of the ways to improve your ability to assess is also to improve your content knowledge. So that's one also as well. Okay. Now we have an interesting question over here. In the advent of modern technology comes, of course, artificial intelligence. How do you assess students authentically now that AI tools and apps are very common? I think this is interesting, and I think this is much easier.
Very, very interesting in the wake of AI, like pervasive. It has become pervasive in education. This was interesting because two webinars ago, this was the topic of KUAN as well, right? How to integrate AI in teaching. And this time, it's the other end of the coin. How do we assess when, in fact, students are beginning to have more of AI? This is particularly stubborn, let me state that, if you're going for stuff that require verbal written aspects, right? So that's often where they have a lot of AI integration. Excuse me. In my experience, I think that I'd like to think that we teachers have that particular sixth sense that the students are, to use a phrase that was in the very previous seminar just last week, something that Miss Annie Paris mentioned, we often sense that it's too good to be true. So that can help pinpoint that they're using AI, right? In this case, the best thing to go for authentic assessment is, instead of going for homeworks, you have the assignments live and, yeah, real time, because that will give them little opportunity to utilize other tools. So this makes it so that the output is organic, right? When organic, I meant that it comes from them and you have there is no way that this could not be from them because it's real time and live. So if the difficulty has something to do with, you want to shore down their usage of AI in things that you want to ask from them organically, I would suggest that instead of homeworks, you go for stuff that can be seen live. Oftentimes, the dimension of authentic assessment is that it happens real time, right? It's a simulation, it's an output that happens in class. There might be preparation involved, but I think as a teacher, you can have um, aspects in your rubrics that grade that, the verbal quality, the preparation that went into it, the richness of detail, and even something like writing technique. So if you feel that they're doing too much AI, you can have a characteristic or a criterion for writing technique, whether it be organic or not. So that is at least one of the ways that I can find that you can curtail their usage of AI, at least as a tool for aiding them to make something that you would have wanted them to make organically.
I don't know if I can add on this one, or I'd be in a different school of thought.
Go
But
ahead, Miss.
but on the case of AI, a lot of people are actually thinking about authenticity or originality. Uh, AI can do a lot of things, but with AI, children and students can also do a lot of things when it comes to learning. And this might be sounding controversial for me, for everyone who are listening. But in APA right now, you can cite AI, and you can, uh, depending on the regulation, you can actually use AI for specific dimensions or parts of what you are actually doing. So, to be honest, the APA or American Psychology Association, that's the way we cite and create bibliographies, am I right? Especially in research, has already accepted the fact that AI is pervasive. And even researchers are now using AI to improve what they know. So instead of curtailing our students from using AI, let's teach our students how to use them properly in learning, rather than saying that by using AI, you are not being original. The thing is that AI is now becoming a part that eventually will help students later on to be better at learning. The only thing is that if your teacher does not know how to teach you how to use AI, then definitely that's some problem over there. So
Y-
I'm not saying that let your students use AI so that they can give you an output, but help your students understand what the role of AI is in their studying
Truly,
in
that was
such
a
a way
very good point, ma'am.
they can use it to improve themselves. In fact, I would like to tell you that I have been using grammar AI tools before to be able to learn how to properly write in the English language. You know, I am a dyslexic person and I have a really difficult time in like reading and also expressing myself in words. But because of AI, because of AI, technically I was learning from it. The app was actually Grammarly. And whenever Grammarly checks my grammar, I also try to see why it actually suggested these over my words. So then I realized I have been using similar words or I have been using prepositions incorrectly. I do not understand how prepositions work, or I have a difficulty in trying to link together my subject and objects. So that's how I learned how to write later on. And on my own, I was getting better and better. So my way of thinking of AI is to facilitate my learning rather than letting AI do the work for me. So if we can teach our students that, that would be better. Okay. Now let's have another. Do you have an interesting question, by the way, Sir Ryan? You would want to see being answered. There are a lot of questions right now. Okay. This one, Sir Ryan, I think this is interesting. Since I am handling 70 plus students in one session, sir, do you have advice on a bigger group or smaller group? Or it will depend on the topic?
Whether to use small groups or big groups, it depends a lot on the topic and what you're trying to achieve. But what I do want to point out, which is something that I've learned from a mentor also in a previous engagement, was number one, no matter the size of the group, do not just instruct them to do group work. It's also important to instruct them how to do the group work. That is also one of the things that I find anecdotally in less experienced teachers. They say, do this, do that, but they do not give specific instructions on how to go about accomplishing the task. So it's important to set expectations. On a very basic level, whenever it's a group work, my practice is to always specify roles that students have. Like, so if for instance, let's say it's a group of five, I always have five roles that they need to fill in. So each student has a role to play and can be held accountable for that role so that you assure that each one has a task to do, essentially. Because oftentimes the difficulty in group works, which is why we need supervision, a point that Ms. Jera was emphasizing with AI also, is that there's a lot of piggybacking and people not actually doing stuff. So in order to make them accountable, no matter how large or small the group, add roles to play. Like it can be any role you can imagine. Like in an experiment, you can have one who prepares, one who borrows, one who does the cleaning, one who does the actual experimentation, one who does the documentation, for as long as each one is accountable for a task. That is the key thing I believe that should be addressed.
Mm. Thank you so much, sir. So it depends, no? And it also depends on your creativity.
Yeah,
uh,
sky's the
crea-
limit.
Sky is the limit if you have enough amount of creativity to do things with your students, you know? Okay, there are a lot of questions here, sir, which regards to like authentic assessment being outside, like immersion,
Mhm.
fieldworks, and of course, this entails a lot of budgeting and also parental as well as administrative support. And also, there is this authentic assessment that would include, like, say, for example, video production, okay, and other these are categorized as authentic assessment, but not all students have the skills to do such. I remember that you said that you can have a multimodal way of doing authentic assessment so that the students can actually pick what assessment, what kind of
Yeah.
output they have to give. Um, do you have other opinions or do you have other suggestions with regards to this one? I have in mind, but I want to hear from you.
Just to address that, Ms. Jet, no, when I was reading the question, the thought that came to mind was you really have to know who your students are. So if it's not feasible for them, then you can just forego that. So for example, if they not have the resources to create a film or something, you can exchange that for something else. So the important thing is to know your students. Again, this goes back to drafting the assessment plan initially. What do you want assessed? The other thing that I like to address, because you mentioned immersion, I think there was a question about it's difficult to do when it comes to budget, parental support, etc. And indeed, that is the main issue. The thing that I found helpful was to always engage the stakeholders, right? The administration in your school, etc. So what I do, I can think of at least two things that this happened. One was I engaged the administration in conversation when we wanted to change the final exams to something practical in a previous school that I worked with. So we really had a plan prepared. It was presentation style. And because we had data to present and something meaty to present to them, they agreed for as long as we were very, very specific about what we wanted to do, how we wanted to assess, and what we would be getting from the students. So everything is fleshed out and detailed. The other thing was about the immersion thingy. Yeah, in my case in UP, I'm very, very fortunate that the culture that we have is very progressive towards this. It's really a lot. It's a task. It's a Herculean task to come across. We need a lot of chaperones. You need time to prepare it. A lot of paperwork goes into this. But I think that it's about the rewards being well worth it, I believe. So just to give you an example, the two things that I've experienced this year was the field study last year and this year, and then a film, no, 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 a field trip to the museum with younger students this time. And it's just the rewards are well worth it for the hassle that you need to go through and the hoops you need to go through in order to plan it up. So just engage with the stakeholders, engage them in conversation, and make sure that everything's planned. On the second note, Miss Je, about the second question, I believe, was related to yeah, I answered that already. The one where technologically or logistically, it's not possible to apply a particular authentic assessment. You can always change that for something else that would be most apt for your locale and your setting and your group of learners. Ms. Je,
Okay.
about your own opinion, I'd like to pick apart your brain as well.
I think this is just one thing that I have observed with a lot of my students before. I have been teaching graduate school for quite some time for already. They often think of authentic assessment as something that should be very creative and would require a lot of time. But my authentic assessment is a range of things that you can do inside a classroom as well. And it does not necessarily need to be something that is grandiose or to be something that is very much creative. As you can see, Ryan, I often give you some well, we have been together in a class that is online. But did you know that when you are actually reading your papers and we are actually discussing, that is authentic assessment? So as simple as that, that is authentic assessment. Why? Because I was able to evaluate and determine how well you have learned from the paper by actually being with you while you are reading the paper. So the range of authentic assessment that you can do in your class depends on what you can do in the class inside its limiting factors. So for example, your limitation is money or budget, then you find a way that the learning of the students is authentic and thereby needed to be assessed authentically. So for example, you want your students to understand tension, for example, tension or muscle movements, then they can actually use their own body, and that's authentic. And how they describe the movements of their body and the muscles that you wanted to pinpoint is actually part of authentic assessment. It does not really need an output, but it's an authentic experience for them that they can actually describe. So that's authentic assessment. It's just that it is formative and not output based. So in a way, a lot of people often think that formative assessments, both conventional and authentic, are often insignificant. But these are the larger chunks. These should be the larger chunks of your class. Okay? So say, for example, having a video or having a music video or a poster making, you cannot do that every day. You set them based on your objectives, where you can actually put it as a summation of all the things that they have learned based on the objectives that are given and based on the objectives that you tried to comply with. Okay? So there are ways you can do authentic assessment in the classroom as a formative manner. So not grandiose, based on the limitations of the classroom and the ability of your students, and also within the context of the objectives that you want them to learn. Okay, so that's another way of thinking about it. Okay, so if you cannot do immersion, then don't do immersion. It's easier for them. That is both a summation of all the things that they actually learn, but at the same time, things that they can authentically describe. Okay, so those are some things that you might want to think about. Okay, now, Sir Ryan, any question you wanted to answer?
I think I'd just like to address this, Ms. Jeb, before we end, perhaps, because there's a lot of questions about rubrics. Like, do we have to use different ones, or do we have to it actually depends, ma'am. In my case, what I do in practice, and this is again anecdotal, is that I have pre-made rubrics for like large constructs. Like I have one for performance-based, one for an output-based activity, and one for like something Ms. Jera said, something that you do as a formative assessment. So I have like 3 rubrics pre-made. And then I often, in order to enhance granularity or how detailed your rubrics are, there is a segment there that I just swap in and out depending on what really it is that I'm actually doing. Like for instance, if I'm doing, I've recently done like to what Ms. Jera said, no, but it doesn't have to be grandiose. It can be in the course of one day. So we were talking about plate tectonics, I think it was, and I wanted them to do a mock trial act like lawyers, and then they defend essentially plate tectonics, and I dressed up like the judge, and with the gavel and all that. It was fun, but essentially that was performance based, but very very verbal. So I had to switch out a few of the rubric criteria to add something that has something to do with speech and language faculty. So it's just something that you can switch in and out. As mentioned by Ms. Jet, this becomes enriched when you know more. So with experience, it becomes better. So that was why one of my point was just to do it. Try applying authentic assessment, strive for authenticity where possible because it comes with experience. I hope that satisfies the thing on rubric. So you can have either one general one or a few pre-made ones that settle for large swathes of different methodologies that you can then fine tune depending on what actual activity you go for.
I can suggest, however, in creating rubrics is you start with conventional assessment and check. I don't know if you're doing this, but if you're doing a number of measurements when it comes to your conventional assessments, such as having a TOS, such as having some determining the discriminatory indices of your questions, you will realize later on that this can be later transcribed into a more qualitative rubric rather than a quantitative measurement. So if you really wanted to create a rubric that would suit a specific objective, then you may start with the conventional assessment. Again, conventional assessment is also very, very useful. Again, these are two school of thoughts. These are not opposite of each other. These is a range of things that you can do, and you can use them in complementation with each other. So don't be very against conventional assessment. Don't also be very against authentic assessment. Create a balance between the two when it comes to assessing your students. Okay. And then also when it comes to the objectives, there are objectives that can be both addressed by conventional and authentic assessment. It depends upon what activity you wanted for your students to engage in. So if you are looking at your objectives, think of what activity you want your students to experience before designing your own assessment plans. Because if you don't know what kind of activity, it's a learning design context. If you don't know what kind of activity or what kind of responses you wanted to get from your students when teaching this particular objective or topics, then you wouldn't know how to create your own assessment plans. And the assessment plans is where you can actually take both conventional and authentic assessment into one place. Okay, so that's also one thing that we can actually suggest. Okay, so I think this is the end of our Q&A session. This has been a very fast Q&A session. Not fast because very few questions are there, but fast because of how many ideas we have right now being taken back and forth, being discussed back and forth. And I do hope everyone in the attendance were also really looking into the discussion that we have in the Q&A session. So at this junction, I say at this moment, may I call in? May I call in Sir Nand for the awarding of the certificate? And of course, this, my dear attendees, this will also be the end of our live streaming. So don't you worry. Okay. So let's call Sir Nand. Sir Nand?
Okay. Thank you so much, Miss Jara, and thank you so much, Sir Ryan, for this very informative and insightful session this afternoon. Again, on behalf of the UP Cebu's Teaching and Learning Resource Center and also the UP Cebu Master of Education program, we extend our heartfelt gratitude and congratulations for this successful event. As what you can see right now on the screen, we are presenting the certificate of appreciation is rewarded to Mr. Ryan Daniel R. Dablo for sharing his invaluable time and expertise as our guest speaker in the webinar on conventional versus authentic assessment in science teaching. Given this 17th day of July 2024 at the University of the Philippines, Cebu, signed by yours truly and also our MEd or Master of Education Program Coordinator, Professor Kim P. Bundok. Again, Sir Ryan, congratulations for this event.
Thank you very much, Fernand and TLRC. It was a pleasure, sir. Thank you
Thank
also.
you.
Thank you so much, Sir Ryan.
Thank you, Miss Jera. Always a pleasure to be working alongside you, Miss.
Thank you so much. Okay, so now that we have ended our Q&A session as well as the giving of certificates, we are now bound for our evaluation. Don't forget to evaluate. Kindly check on the QR code. You can see right at the moment. You can check on that QR code or use the link or the website below. Kindly make sure that you input the correct format and spelling of your name and the correct email address. Always make sure to click send me a copy of my responses before submitting. And normally it takes less than 3 minutes to receive your e-certificate. However, for some, if you do not receive it today, then you might want to send an email to lrc.upcebu at up.edu.ph if there are some problems regarding your e-certificate. Okay, normally the e-certificate will be available 3 minutes after you have evaluated. And don't forget that we have a lot of sessions coming in, not just this session, but more KUAN session in education. And I do hope you can also invite your friends, family, and colleagues in the school, in your schools, to be with us learning here in the airspace of the online education system that we have here. Okay, it's good learning online. It's free and it's fun. Okay. Now, if for those who are in our Zoom meeting, you may check on the link that is being shown to you right now via the chat box. Okay. Hi, Miss Arta. Ryan is here with us. How was your experience, Sir Ryan?
It's always fun, these are like, our tiny giving back, paying it forward, giving it back to the country and educational sector in particular. So, yeah, looking forward to the rest of the KUAN episodes.
Thank you so much. Okay, now are we ready for the